I'm Jung-Sil Lee, Vice President of the Washington Coalition for Comfort Women Issues. The first of all, I really have to say I feel so honored to get to know these wonderful presenters and three discussants after I read their papers, and I realized that really true scholars, activists, and wonderful person. So I really have to do some recognition that we kind of omit. The first thing is Academy of Korean Studies in Seoul. We got a fund in the month of April, and without their support, all this symposium and seminar couldn't be possible. And second thing is the Korean Studies Center at George Mason University. The Professor Young-Chan Roh, he's gone. Is there a Professor Roh here? Maybe he got tired, but he really supported, he coordinated the symposium room and then exhibition halls and everything. So I really thank for them. And then also the symposium is supposed to be after this symposium, the papers will be compiled and then published and then distributed as many as possible in universities and any institutions. The theme of today's symposium would be Korean Asian Comfort Women Issues, then and now. I'm sorry, it's really long. And tracing is political, historical, political, and cultural aspects of comfort women movements in U.S. and South Korea. I intentionally use this term, the comfort women movement, because comfort women became a lens through which we can expand and explore more larger sense of human right and the woman's right and everything. So we have a wonderful sixth presenter, and I was going to introduce one by one. Actually, that was my initial intention, but kind of a lack of time. You have every bio in your program, so kind of skip the detailed biography. Would you forgive me that? Okay, skipping your bio. The first presenter will be Dr. Bani Oh.
You don't have to introduce me.
No. But I just want to do one thing that clarifies. She's a retired professor for Georgetown University, but just one thing that I wanted to focus on. This is not a first Comfort Women Symposium, maybe second in US, because she's the one, maybe the co-convener of the Comfort Women Symposium held in Georgetown University. Maybe the Yona Martin didn't know about the fact, but she's going to present about her paper, especially that she organized the symposium.
Okay.
Could you give her, a big round of applause?
Congressman Honda, ladies and gentlemen, and former colleagues, and thank you for being here, and I appreciate your presence and support for comfort women issues. It is a difficult act to follow after Congressman Michael Honda's very fact-packed activities on a high level of governments in the U.S. and in Japan. But my talk is going to be only looking back to the first academic conference on comfort women issues at Georgetown University. And we were supposed to be really making a summary of some talk, but as you know, I'm not a native English-speaking person. It's oftentimes easier for me to read written text, but I will do my best to shorten my talk. Okay, now I need a reading glass too. On the afternoon of September 30th, 1996, an unprecedented event took place at Georgetown University. The very first international academic symposium on the subject of comfort women, the topic that had been hidden for half a century. We called it the Comfort Women of World War II, Legacy and Lessons. The planners, including myself, could not have anticipated this at the time, but we opened the floodgate for future similar gatherings. Some people even speculated that conference might have impacted the U.S. Department of Justice's decision to apply Holtzman Amendment of 1978 to Japanese war criminals of the Second World War. The amendment, named after Elizabeth Holtzman, a New York Congresswoman between 1973 and 81, had hitherto affected only Nazi war criminals. But on the 3rd of December, a little over 2 months after our gathering, the Justice Department issued a watch list of 16 Japanese individuals ineligible to enter the United States. 3 among them had committed comfort women-related crimes. The Justice Department's decision was published on the front page of the Washington Post of December 4th, 1996. 2 days later, the paper carried an editorial, War Criminals, Then and Now. I was one of the 2 conveners of the conference. This paper is a reflective piece with recollections of Professor Margaret Stetz and me. And I will skip the bio again. I will let you read the bio and the booklet you are receiving. I just want to share with you our experience of feeling humiliation at being turned away, of being condescended to and ignored, and even of dealing with an attempt at sabotage by the Japanese embassy during the last stage of preparation, but also of enjoying jubilation and elation at the conclusion of our endeavor. I'm not at all implying that this success was the result of just the work of 2 of us. It was indeed a joint effort of several of us, including Ms. Dong Lee Ham, Professor Chris Simpson of American University, David Kim of Korea Society Washington office, which no longer exists, who attended countless planning committee meetings, and a multitude of other entities which overcame initial resistance to support us. It had 3 major sponsors: Georgetown University, Washington Coalition for Comfort Women Issues, and Korea Society Washington office. The support for funding came from 5 external sources, ranging from Maryknoll Fathers to Korean Taekwondo Foundation. Within Georgetown, 19 departments and programs and centers donated money, including student organizations. Average amount ranged widely from $25 to $50 from student organizations, and $100 to only $200 from departments, and a few $1,000s from the dean's office and the provost's office. This meant that Margaret and I walked, knocked, bowed, and pleaded almost up to the moment of conference opening. Even as the conference was starting, we did not know whether we could pay for airfare for 3 speakers from Korea, Australia, and Japan, including the first-class airfare for the keynote speaker, as well as for their lodging. Not only did we wear our souls thin, but we also heard a lot of unsolicited advice and comment bordering on threat, making me extremely insecure because I was only in the 2nd semester at Georgetown. Despite the shortage of funding and hostile environment we were operating, we did not want to compromise the quality of the conference. We planned a half-a-day conference because that was all we could afford. But we encountered amazing happenings. To borrow a baseball analogy, if you build it, they will come. We had dared to tackle a taboo subject, and people came out of the woodwork. Those who had been working on the subject or on related matters sought us out and offered to present and display their work out of sheer love and dedication to the subject. We only needed to provide a venue. A half-day conference expanded to featuring ongoing programs, which extended to 2 weeks that consisted of 3 consecutive evenings of film screening, enlarged photo exhibit on huge 10 6x4 panels in the Galleria at the atrium of the conference building for 5 days, and an exhibit of books, catalogs, and artwork in a large glass case for 2 more weeks. This was nothing short of a miracle. For the symposium itself, we lined up distinguished academic panelists, including Dr. Yuki Tanaka from Australia, a Japanese-born scholar now of Hiroshima Peace Institute. We also wanted to invite 2 central speakers, high-profile keynoter, preferably a sympathetic Japanese political figure and a surviving comfort woman. As usual, Mrs. Jong-Lee Ham invited Ms. Yunxin Kim, who, as it turned out, was both healthy enough to travel from Korea and willing to give testimony about her ordeal. Finding a keynote speaker was another story. We had no one as late as 4 months before the meeting and 16 months into our preparation. Then in the May 12th edition of New York Times, we noticed a short report about the resignation of Mrs. Mutsuko Miki, who incidentally died on the last day of July of this year, from the Asian Women's Fund, a fund that the Japanese government had announced a year earlier with some acclaim and self-acclaim to make payments to comfort women. Mrs. Miki was the widow, was Takeo Miki, former Prime Minister of Japan between 1974 and 76, and she herself was an internationally admired women's leader. She had agreed to serve with the fund with the promise from the Japanese government that the latter would assist her and contribute substantially to it. But the Japanese reneged on both. She resigned in protest against the idea of private and unofficial compensation rather than official reparation. I still do not know where we got such courage and audacity, but Margaret and I dared to write to her with an information provided by a Japanese-born Georgetown University graduate student. We also asked if she could send us a draft of her speech 2 weeks earlier. Within a month, we got a positive response on both. A month before our opening date, I received a call from my dean, Robert Gallucci of the School of Foreign Service. I hurried down, feeling nervous what he wanted to talk to me. As soon as I sat down, he asked, "Do you know who just visited me?" I said, "Who?" "The Japanese DCM, the Deputy Chief of Missions at the embassy." "What did he want and why are you telling me this?" I asked. "He wanted me to prevent you from holding the Comfort Women Conference." My heart sank. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "What do you think?" I truly did not know what to think. It was possible that there was something bigger at stake, not just between the university and the embassy, but between the US and the Japanese government as well. A few more months passed. Obviously, I was anxious. Finally, the dean resumed the conversation. I told him that he was in the United States and he could not interfere with academic freedom of an American institution of higher learning. And he continued, I fully support your project, and I'll be happy to make the opening comment. One more thing, he said. I am proud that Georgetown is holding the first academic conference on the subject. Mrs. Mutsuko Miki arrived at Dulles International Airport 3 days before the conference. We went to meet her and hoped that she would give us a draft of the speech she promised 2 weeks earlier. She didn't say anything, didn't give us anything, but out of courtesy, we did not ask for it. Not surprisingly, there was no one from the Japanese embassy to welcome the 80-year-old widow of a former prime minister. The Japanese embassy did not even invite her for so much as an afternoon tea, all during her 5-day stay in the DC area. On the day of the symposium, 350-seat auditorium was filled to capacity. While both Mrs. Miki and Ms. Yunshin Kim spoke, the audience was captivated. When Ms. Kim talked about her joyride at age 14 in a military truck turned into an abduction into a military brothel, we could hear quiet weeping. But the crowd broke into applause when Mrs. Miki said, given the Imperial Army's involvement in this outrage, the Japanese government should play a direct role in compensating women. That's all we wanted for the moment, that a former prime minister's widow would acknowledge the Japanese government's direct involvement in the comfort woman system. Our conference was only the beginning, but we opened the door for debate, and we felt relieved and elated. The reaction to the symposium was uniformly positive. Several of the planners spread out across America. They included Professor Simpson, Mrs. Dong-Lee Han, Margaret Stetz, David Kim, all over the United States, including Japan. The U.S. Holocaust Museum and the Free Library of Philadelphia were just two of the prominent organizations that hosted comfort women discussions. We joined forces with Chinese groups on World War II Japanese war crimes. We invited late Iris Chang, the author of The Rape of Nanking, to our subsequent meetings. We literally became the preachers for the cause. Numerous people expressed interest in obtaining a volume of the conference proceedings. Professor Stetz and I co-edited a book containing a record of the conference proceedings with additional contributions on the issue of comfort women. Our volume, called Legacies of the Comfort Woman of World War II, was published 5 years later in 2001 by Emmy Sharp. It was but one of the first scholarly works in the growing body of the literature on comfort women. I would like to conclude with an optimistic note, for the torch is being passed on to younger generations. On August 1st of this year, While traveling in Korea with my immediate family of 15, I participated in the ongoing weekly Comfort Women demonstrations in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, which began 22 years ago. My grandchildren, ages between 10 and 18, insisted joining me. They sat on the curb across from the Japanese embassy holding signs in Korean that they could not read, but chanted slogans together with nearly 100 students as young as 8 and 10. It was one of the hottest days of the summer, but the animated voices of young protesters echoed through the streets of Seoul and across the palace grounds not far away with the last dynasty of Korea, which Japan had terminated with its invasion and occupation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Oh. Nobody didn't bother us for this symposium. Thank you for your effort, the previous effort. I kind of skipped the structure of a symposium. Actually, there are 6 presenters, like a 10-minute presentation. You might get some calculation, number of minutes. There are 6, and then we have 10 minutes, and then 5 minutes of a discussion, 3 discussion, and then it will lead up to the public questions and comments. And then Honorable Michael Honda will give us some closing remarks. So next presenter, Chris Simpson, Professor of Communication in American University. And he's going to talk about racial and gender and
as you know, we've been authored papers. I've done a paper, the title of which is 정신대, Co-Evolution of Gender Iniquity, Imperialism, and Resistance. And it's a history of how people conceptualized military sexual slavery. It's too long to read, so I'm going to try to speak informally. It's about how comfort women have been persecuted, the way in which it happened, the social way, in a sense, and how they resisted, both before 1945 and after 1945. So the first question is, what forms of oppression have they faced? And what I would argue is 3. Patriarchy, the social stratification of Korea, and imperialism. Patriarchy, of course, is the power of men over women. But it manifests itself in many ways, including cultural ways, but also in economic ways, and in the capacity to make a decision, and whether or not you get schooled as a child, and many other very important, very basic things in people's lives. Second, social stratification, that's the hierarchy of power within a country, in this case, Korea. And third, imperialism, which is the power of one country over another, which in this case is Japan over Korea. Japan had colonized Korea. It, to a very large extent, ran its government and many social institutions. In many parts of Korea, you had to, or in many institutional settings, you had to speak Japanese, not Korean. All right. These different types of oppression, they overlap with each other, and they reinforce each other. And you can see how this worked in the way Japan went about bringing comfort women into the system of military sexual slavery. For example, when the Japanese military began this practice, they turned to collaborators in the Korean government and in the Korean police structure to gather these women up. What women were gathered up? Well, often the poorest women, the women who had perhaps been sold as children, the women whose families had terrible debts, or who even prosperous women sometimes, educated women sometimes, but whose families had had some terrible misfortune, economic, that made the person vulnerable. So you see the relationship between the imperial power and the social stratification in Korea and the targeting of these particular women. Bing, bing, bing. You see it also in the particular types of lies that the Japanese told to the women and told to the Korean government officials often to convince them to cooperate in this program. At the beginning, these were volunteers. Forgive my terrible pronunciation of Korean words, but 정신대, which means roughly a person who has given himself or herself to the country, which in this context meant the country of Japan, not Korea. And the enlistment of people through volunteering in this fashion. Okay. Now, the basic facts of the Korean women's experience in the military brothels and rape camps are well known. I'm not trying to downplay it in any sense, but our audience here is familiar with it. So I'm not going to go through it in the depth that it deserves tonight. But by 1945, the Japanese government had taken to calling these women yanfu, or yanfu hyuken, I believe is the pronunciation in Japanese. And by that time, it was clear that the earlier euphemisms about volunteering and so forth, they were breaking down. People could see through them instantly. But the Japanese military still wanted a way that they can discuss these women in official correspondence without being out and out vulgar. There were vulgar words used as well. And I'll spare you those, but to use an American reference, it would be roughly similar to the N-word in English, combined with a very derogatory characterization of a woman. That was the word on the street. That was the way ordinary people saw these women. That was a set of attitudes. It wasn't just an insult. Rather, it was a statement of, this is your status. You are the lowest of the low. And you may not question somebody higher than you. Why? All right. So, but 1945 came. And for those who survived, the Japanese military sex slavery system was broken, and they tried to return to their homes. This was a very bitter homecoming, because the women themselves were not welcomed back into Korean society often, and sometimes not into their own families. Why? Because they were the Korean equivalent of the N-word and this insulting characterization of a woman. And in fact, the imperialism held the nationalism, which had contested Japanese imperialism, unfortunately in this particular sense, tended to reinforce the patriarchy, so that the women who had been raped by Japanese were actually rejected because they had been raped by Japanese. Do you follow me? All right. So what was the political situation in Korea in the 1940s and the 1950s? Well, we know the big picture. Split into two, Korean War, and so forth and so on. What is less understood about it is that Korea had been run by the Japanese for the previous almost 50 years. The educated people of the time, the government of the time, the police forces of the time, the universities, the schools, all were still heavily influenced by the Japanese, and in some cases run by the people who had run them under the Japanese. So some of these systems of patriarchy and some of the existing system of the social stratification of Korea, it was still in place. Now, when the war broke out between the North and South, one of the things that happened were hundreds of thousands of foreign troops came to the peninsula. In the North, you know that Chinese troops entered. In the South, it was troops from many nations, but most particularly from the United States. And those troops, in some of them, they're still stationed there today. Throughout the 1950s, there were hundreds of thousands of Western troops permanently stationed in South Korea in their own military bases. The Rhee government and later the Park military dictatorship created a new system of government licensed sex work to serve these soldiers. That system was extremely profitable, and it also created part of the social base for the continuation of the Park dictatorship. What did they do? Well, what they did, among other things, was to suppress human rights, suppress the right to speak, suppress any type of conversation that would raise questions about their own power, and particularly about the system of licensed sexual work for military purposes. I'm not arguing that the American system was or the South Korean system is the same as the Japanese system. You have to analyze it. You have to actually look at it, the actual proof, the details. It wasn't the same. But it wasn't all that much different. Okay. What did that mean as far as the comfort women issue is concerned? It meant that even at a time when there were thousands and probably tens of thousands of surviving women in Korea who had been through this experience, there was no discussion of what took place. There was no discussion at the 1951 peace conference. It was a non-existent crime. There was no discussion later of this particular crime when South Korea and later North Korea made different types of agreements with each other to renew relations. The three types of oppression had combined to erase the reality of this crime at a time when the victims were still alive. Okay. So what that means in terms, and I don't want to go on too long here, but what that means is that the process by which people won the freedom to speak and to bring their stories forward was deeply connected with the new understanding and of the comfort woman system. That did not come forward, the history did not come forward until there was enough democracy and a strong enough women's movement in South Korea to make it come forward. That happened in the 1980s and early 1990s. The Korean Council for against what?
Drafted military.
Yes, women drafted for military sexual slavery by Japan was established, I believe, in 1991, November 1991. The Washington Coalition for Comfort Women Issues was established in November, December 92.
1992.
92,
December.
yes. Okay. And there were many other dates of this controversy back and forth. I'm not going to go through all these dates. But what I want to point to is that those developments were depended upon, in very important ways, the courage of individual women to come forward and speak about their experiences. And this was a very difficult decision. Very difficult. Come forward in courts, come forward in public, come forward in demonstrations, come forward in rooms like this. The victories of the Comfort Women movement, I believe, are tied at least in part to this process of people testifying for themselves, taking the old stories about who they are and what they were worth and where they stood in the world, and saying, no, that's a false story. Here's the real story. Talking to one another and so forth. WCCW has published on 3 different occasions stories about people's testimony about this, and many other groups have as well. So I'm going to wrap up there and say that, number 1, you've got these systems of oppression. Number 2, they don't go away. They linger. They reconstitute themselves. They reassert themselves. Number 3, part of the way that you bring about change and you bring about a defeat of these types of systems is by speaking out, speaking to one another, learning about your own dignity, expressing your own experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. And maybe the Professor Min will back to the patriarchal system is still lingering in the Korea in your paper later on. So next speaker would be Dong-Lee Han. She's a chair of board of WCCW currently, and then she was a founding president of WCCW for 20 years. For 20 years. Okay, she's going to talk about the history of WCCW.
Dr. Jung-Shin Lee asked me to cover on trace the history of 20 years of WCCW. And since I did serve 10 years for the first 10 years, and I'm sure Dr. So will be covering the other part. Oh, what? No, yes. Okay. I'm truly honored. The journey of WCCW is about the history of people who made the WCCW mission possible today. And I'm reminded of valuable memories about those who helped me and the Comfort Woman issue. First of all, I want to honor Kim Hak-soon, Hwang Kum-ju, and other many surviving Comfort Woman victims who bravely stepped forward to declare the world that they have been the victims of the sex slaves of Japanese military during World War II. Secondly, I want to pay my respect to the people of Japan, not the government of Japan, who have taken the initial movement in Asia to restore the justice and honor of Comfort Women. Next, I want to express my sincere appreciation to those innumerable people who have given me strength and wisdom along with all the support we need. I regret I cannot list their names. I have to spend all night to list their names. But lately, I get questions from my friends about the motive of my getting involved in Comfort Woman issues. Dr. O raised the same question recently. Mrs. Ham, what was your incentive getting involved in this issue? I wish I could answer your question, Dr. O. It was 2 days before the Thanksgiving Day of 1992. Miss Hwang Kum-ju was on the stage of Korean United Methodist Church in Virginia to speak about her experience as a sex slave of World War II. Her statement is still very fresh in my memories. I was 17 when I was taken to the Japanese military comfort station and was raped by several tens of Japanese soldiers a day. She cried out loudly. And now Japanese government blames me as a liar. 3 days later, her story was aired by the Fox News station in the Great Washington area, and the public reaction was like being hit by a bomb. 2 weeks later, WCCW was established. They set the criteria of the president being with a woman with background of English, Korean, and Japanese. I was appointed the president. In 1990s, very few people would have heard of comfort women or would known about comfort women. Following Hwang Geum-ju's testimony, I was like receiving a mental blow due to the reporters firing questions after questions on top of inquiries. On March 1st, 1993, WCCW organized an initial action, a rally in front of Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. It was to protest the Japanese government's rejection of its responsibility for crimes against comfort women, and secondly, advertise the foundation of WCCW. Demand of action plans started lined up. I was invited to attend the International Symposium in Tokyo in April 1993. It was hosted by Japanese women leaders, headed by Doi Takako, then head of Japanese National Society, Social Party. Doi Takako's special request to me is clearly in my memory by every word. In Japanese, she said, "Lee-san, アメリカに行ったら、アメリカの政府を起こして、日本の政に外圧を変えるのを動いてください。It means, Mrs. Ham, when you get back to America, please try to move the U.S. government to give pressure to the Japanese government. Japanese government is very strong with national pressure, but is very weak with international pressure. It has to be the American government whose pressure should work." Thus, the WCCW action plan was established, namely moving U.S. government to force the Japanese government. That was our mission action. Passage to the U.S. government is through U.S. Congress, and it was not an easy task. An excellent opportunity was coming. The Japanese Prime Minister Minister Hosokawa was coming to the United States, give a keynote speech at the UN in the fall of 1993. I wrote an open letter addressed to Hosokawa requesting an official apology and a legal reparation to the sex slaves of Japanese military during World War II. And I want to advertise this on Washington Post. The problem was WCCW did not have such a fund. We needed money. I didn't know where to go, so I made a decision. I decided to retire, take early retirement from the World Bank. I had been working for 25 years. Luckily, I became eligible to take early retirement at end of May 1993. And I used the money to advertisement of the letter on Washington Post. In June 1994, the Japanese emperor visited US for a summit meeting with President Clinton. We organized a rally again in front of White House. Asian and American united to redress Japanese war crimes. We delivered a joint letter addressed to Bill Clinton and Emperor Hirohito, along with the petition by 8,000 individuals demanding an official apology and legal reparation. Mrs. Ahn did take leadership of getting all these signatures from 8,000 individuals. In the fall of 1994, with the support of my husband, who was formerly a Korea Times editor, we traveled to South Korea for interviews with the surviving comfort women. Upon return, we immediately published a first video, Comfort Women, the testimony of 16 sex slaves of Japanese military during World War II. The video presentation and the exhibit on Comfort Women took place in June of 1995 at the United Methodist Church, which is located next to U.S. Supreme Court. In the UMC building were Mr. Gingrich's private office, the private residence of Al Gore's parents, and many other congressional members had their office there. The Comfort Woman video was turned on 8 hours a day in the lobby of UMC, where many students from all over the nation visited on a congressional tour. I can go on all night, but due to the time limit, I have to short my speech, and I want to go for major WCCW activities since the brief, since then, 1995. Just major activities we did organize and we handled. Presentation of video and an exhibition, The Comfort Woman, at the 4th UN World Conference on Women in Beijing. The President, Christine Choi, and our couple went to Beijing, taking all the pictures and organized an exhibit there. 1996, I am summarizing those activities. There are pages and pages of activities, but I have to shorten that. Please forgive me. Provision of historical photos to Time magazine for the first time. Time magazine had carried the several pages of Comfort Woman articles for the first time. International conference at Georgetown University. Dr. O just briefed about her experience, so I'm going to just skip the explanation. In December 1997, presentation on Comfort Woman at the press conference, U.S. Congress. Draft resolution provided to Congressional Representative William O. Lipinski about Comfort Woman for the first time. When I saw the draft of the draft, there was no mention of Comfort Woman. So I talked to the Congressman William Lipinski's office, edition of the Comfort Woman. That's how it was created, the draft of Comfort Woman issue into the presentation. 1998, presentation of significantly expanded exhibit, Comfort Women of World War II, and its indisputable tragedy at Cannon House Office Building. 1999, exhibit Comfort Woman of World War II at Free Library of Philadelphia, where Dr. O and I have traveled to Philadelphia and organized this exhibit. Thank you once again, Dr. O. Without a break, we co-sponsored the 13th Annual Korean American Students Conference with Stanford University and the University of California, Berkeley. That's where I met Do-hyun Kim. He was a Vanderbilt University junior then. Now today, as you just met Do-hyun. At last, in 2000, presentation, Comfort Women of World War II at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, Washington, D.C. And the historical grand event of Year 2000 Remembrance, Women of Dignity and Honor, at the Raven House Office Building, Capitol Hill. 10 surviving sex slaves of World War II were invited from Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, and Indonesia to be honored women of dignity and honor. And at the same year, publication of WCCW book, Comfort Women Speak, Testimony by Sex Slaves of the Japanese Military. Chris Simpson was in charge of coordinating this publication. Thank you. In May of 2002, I attended the international conference, Asian Regional Symposium, demanding liquidation of Japan's past in Pyongyang, North Korea, and I was invited as the international representative from US. That was my last attendance at the international conference. I know, I can just 2 more minutes. The journey of my active 10 years with Comfort Woman issue have turned my life around. As I mentioned about my sad experience of 1993, when I had to make up my mind to take early retirement from the World Bank, I thought I was very sorry about the decision in the first place. But it was not an easy decision then. Now I consider it was the best decision of my lifetime, for which I am very proud of. The lesson I learned through my journey with Comfort Woman issue was never give up. I don't know how hard it gets, and I know it will get harder sometimes. My experience can assure you that when I get to my wit's end, that's where God awaits me. More than 5 years have passed since the passage of H.R. 121 at the U.S. Congress. The Japanese government has been receding from the resolution. This fact is what makes us all sad today. As I said at the conference, at the meeting, we all know that in 1942, during World War II, about 120,000 Japanese Americans were relocated into the internment camps. About a quarter century later, the National Japanese American Memorial was dedicated by the U.S. government near the U.S. Congress. On the monument entrance face stone, President Reagan's statement of apology to the history is clearly and widely imprinted. We did wrong. We WCCW expect a similar gesture taken by the U.S. government to the victims of Japanese internment camp system. Hereby, I want to recommend highly the establishment of Comfort Women Memorial and Museum in the Washington, D.C. in the future. I wanted to commend 2 members here with you, Chris Simpson and Do-hyun Kim. Chris was serving vice president for 10 years, and he accompanied me almost everywhere, many universities, including a trip to Ottawa for a meeting with the upper house member of the Canadian Parliament. Since I saw the upper member, that reminds me of you. And without you, I couldn't manage. Thank you. And as I said, I met Do-hyun at Korean TASCON at Stanford University in 1999. He was there as junior, and he visited WCCW camp, or what do you say, corner. And he raised so many questions. He had such an inquisitive mind, which impressed me. And upon graduation from Vanderbilt, in May 2002, he organized an unprecedented historical event in Tampa, Comfort Women 2002, The Hidden Truth. The mayor of Tampa issued proclamation to declare May 17, 2002 as Comfort Women 2002 Day. Chris, Do-hyun, thank you. I never had a chance to thank you officially. In closing, I would like to share the message of Virginia Representative Mark Kim's message last year. He said, "We are not winning, we are not winners as yet, but we are not losers. As far as Comfort Women issues are concerned, we want to be winners." God bless the Comfort Women issues, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It wouldn't be easy decision transfer for your retirement fund to the Blue Cross, but the God will be provided to your needs. So next two presenter is Margaret Serge, professor of a women's study in Delaware University, and she's going to present about the teaching comfort women issues in U.S. from a perspective, a feminist perspective.
These are the words of Kang Do-kyung in her testimony of 1994, quote, "From that time on, my life became a nightmare. I was only 13 years old and did not even know the word menstruation. Many soldiers had come and gone. I could not even begin to count the number of soldiers who raped me," end quote. Adults wage war, but it is often children who pay the price. In her book, War is Not Over When It's Over, Women Speak Out from the Ruins of War, Anne Jones, a feminist writer and activist, reminds us that, quote, "Amidst the violence of war, children are orphaned, maimed, mutilated, sexually assaulted, kidnapped, forced to be soldiers or servants or sex slaves, tortured and murdered," end quote. Yet the sufferings of the young are often overlooked or rendered invisible, especially when those involved are girls. In matters related to warfare, feminist researchers, as Cynthia Enloe has told us, have quite wisely focused their primary attention on women's experiences, for other sorts of researchers usually have privileged men's experiences only. Until recently, however, not even feminist historians and theorists, who have done so much in general to educate readers about war as a gendered phenomenon, have examined carefully how war-related traumas, such as military, sexual assault, and imprisonment in brothels, affect younger victims. Even at the level of language, the deliberate targeting and exploitation of girls has been erased through commonly used phrases such as the wartime rape of women. To refer exclusively, therefore, to the comfort women issue when we address this particular war crime of World War II is to risk papering over the disturbing reality of child rape, which was endemic to it. In 2000, when Sang-mi Choi Shelsted collected testimonies from survivors of the Japanese Imperial Army's system of sexual slavery, a number of those who spoke with her told of having been forced into military brothels as very young girls, some as 12-year-old children. Such testimony, of course, makes nonsense of any claim that the Japanese army's sexual slaves were willing participants, allegedly able to exercise free agency and to choose prostitution. That girls around the world have been and continue to be vulnerable to military rape during wartime, in fact, deliberately selected for it, suggests not only why the history of the comfort women should be part of education everywhere, but why that education ought to begin early and involve both male and female students. The principle of maintaining innocence must not be an excuse for perpetuating ignorance. Children deserve to know what has happened in the past to girls their own age, what is still happening today, and in the case of comfort women, what the fate of those who survived has been. They need this information to develop an informed moral view of the question of warfare, of those who wage it, and of its gendered consequences. Given the realities of the past and present, it is never too early to learn about such matters. But in the case of the US at least, this knowledge often comes only at the university level and in the few courses that are taught from a feminist perspective, which are rarely required for all undergraduates. Thus, it reaches relatively small numbers of students and does so after their ethical codes and their feelings about war and militarism are already fully formed. The work of those who teach comfort women issues in university settings would be easier if girls and boys alike were first exposed to some mention of the hidden history, as it has been called, in middle school. At the very least, there would be far less reason to call it hidden, a misnomer in any case, as it has been hiding in plain sight for more than 20 years and available that long for study in English language texts, many of which young readers can comprehend. The tools to introduce the subject in age-appropriate ways already exist. But in most cases, students in the US do not encounter stories of the comfort system until they are undergraduates. So what, at that point, are the most effective ways to bridge the chasm that exists between their often relatively privileged lives and those of victims whose horrific realities were quite literally worlds away, in time, in place, in socioeconomic position, and perhaps in religion, ethnicity, and race? How do we create the conditions for learning at a level deeper than that produced by conventional textbooks? Here is where feminist pedagogical approaches have proved not only useful, but essential. Feminist methods have long emphasized the need for active listening, for attention to lost, in quotation marks, lost, or suppressed voices, and for treating narratives of personal experience as crucial sources of historical and political education. Feminist teaching encourages the cultivation of empathy, while maintaining awareness of the asymmetries in terms of power and privilege that often distinguish one person's position from another's. Feminist teaching, too, has illuminated the danger of falling into the trap of pity, of avoiding, condescending to, and patronizing survivors of sexual violence, and the importance of not appropriating someone else's story or cause. When it comes to the difficult work of understanding others' experience and of making efforts on behalf of justice, quote, the best place to walk, as the feminist educationalist Nadine Dolby puts it, is, quote, not in front, but beside. And that is exactly what empathy requires, to walk beside others and to share in their struggle, while acknowledging that one can never know from the inside the agony that motivates that struggle. In the case of survivors of the comfort system, this was often the agony of girls, not of mature women, who were dehumanized and whose bodies were treated as military supplies over a period of years. We need to acknowledge that special form of suffering and to consider its implications. The gender-specific atrocities committed upon those imprisoned within the comfort system were in some ways unique, and in other ways part of a continuum of victimization that has included countless numbers of sufferers, many of them girl children around the globe. In an important work from 1997 called Girls and War Zones, Carolyn Nordstrom asks us to recognize links between the crimes that occur during war and those that occur at other times. Quote, rather than seeing war abuses or child sexploitation as outside the rules and boundaries of average or normal society, we should be asking instead what it is that makes such behaviors possible wherever they are found and what patterns of intolerance link them. As Nordstrom says, quote, the plight of girls living in violent conditions challenges us to question how artificial the boundaries are between war and peace. To read and listen to the stories of the survivors themselves with our full attention, and then to explore the connections between the, quote, hidden histories of the Second World War and the abuses of the present, is an enormous task for any classroom instructor. It is difficult and potentially fruitless work, as it sometimes comes too late in the education of students to make any real difference. But it remains necessary work if we are to have any hope of achieving justice for the survivors of the comfort system, who were often enslaved girls, or of achieving change and preventing new generations of girls from being victims of rape in future wars. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The next presenter is a Professor Okja Seo. She's a professor of Washington Bible College and the former president of WCCW. And she will present her paper title will be Comfort Women, the Past and the Future.
Yeah, in spite of all our continuous efforts to pursue globally, the Japanese government, so far, we have no apologies regarding comfort women issues. And as significant as it is, the final passage of House Resolution 121 in 2007, there was no actual apology part made by Japanese government. So now there might be some issue about why there is no apology has been made in spite of continuous efforts. Now I saw recently I made a research about apology reconciliation. The international reconciliation obviously refers to the between two countries. There will be some agreement, but there are three types: procedural, substantial, and ideational reconciliation. Usually, procedural reconciliation refers to the institutional recovery of relations, such as the normalization of the diplomatic relations, and which usually reconciliation happens. Another one is substantial reconciliation, refers to economic restoration of relations, such as provision of war indemnity or individual compensation. Now, in the case of comfort women, ideational reconciliation, that can be related to comfort women issue, which caused great conflict between Korea and Japan thus far. That is psychological, that requires a lot of psychological restoration of relations based on shared historical understanding and mutual trust. Now, you all know about we have an Asian fund and we go into all other issues, but there is our surviving comfort women. What they want is not actually money or what the material redemption. What they need is restore their dignity and injustice, what they have been afflicted for many years. Now, however, there is some misunderstanding, and we are not focused between Japan and Korea. Korea, that's what our surviving comfort women focus on that. Whereas the Japanese people, they thought, well, we have a substantial reconciliation made because we had Asian Women's Fund we made, and what else? But at the same time, many Japanese people are instructed in they are wrongfully commemorate and remember the World War II. As you all know that for them, World War II is like a holy war. We are advancing the rest of the Asian countries to rescue them from the colonialism of Western countries. So whenever they remember their August at the Ishikawa Shrine or Hiroshima Peace Center, what they remember, what they commemorate is their own sacrificial victims who lost their family or family members, who lost their loved ones. They give their lives for their countries. So for them, the World War II is not something that we should really apologize to the rest of Korea, China, or Philippines for other countries. So I think we need to be more clearly focused on this issue of apology issues, and even look at the history of the United Nations. Since it was not only recently, actually, comfort women sexual slavery system raised the issue in the 1992. There was a human rights subcommittee, human rights on the promotion and protection of human rights subcommission committee. They already mentioned about the sexual slaves and not comfort women station, they called rape stations, started in 92, and then Radhika Kumaraswamy in 1996. Again, Gay McDougall in 1998. They all were appointed as a special rapporteur on the sexual slaves and the World War II victims. And they all came to the same conclusion. A comfort woman is a rape station, not even comfort woman station. However, it continued even in the 2001, continuously also 2000. I have here resolution number 2. 1325 is a United Nations Security Council resolution in 1325. They also adopted unanimously in October 31, 2000. So that is also special needs of women and girls during repatriation and resettlement, rehabilitation, and all this the World War, the sexual slave issues. And also following the 2008, another United Nations Security Council number 1820, which is the same issue of the women's being raped during the wartime, had been addressed. So in the meantime, although House Resolution 121 by the U.S. Congress was sitting here, by the way, as the president, I was privileged and really was so much, heartfelt thank to work with Congressman Honda to pass the House resolution with a grassroots movement and many people's support. And even though all the efforts that we have been doing, there was so far not really on the Japanese part that had been follow-up. So today, I want to come up with some suggestions rather than we just sit on the back say, well, there will be nothing we can do about it. But I think still there was a certain vision and strategies we can go. First, there is some role the role of U.S. government can take of it. Starting in 1995, apologies for Holocaust and its compensation settlements were negotiated at the high level of U.S. government. His name is Stuart Eligenstat. He's an Undersecretary of State as a special envoy. He was credited with devising a solution between Germany compensing the Jewish Holocaust. And secondly, I made a research of Guam. There is a Guam surviving comfort woman. I tried to contact them. I even tried to visit them. However, because of privacy, the family member tried to refuse my interview, but there's still one surviving woman I indirectly informed by the members. If surviving comfort woman issue shed a light on the Guam surviving project, there will be another venue that we can explore the comfort woman issues, because that is territories where the U.S. House of Representatives is represented today. The time that during World War II, where the Guam victims were then, there was under American protectorate territories there. So it's not only issue of the Asian victims, but also American peoples were involved in that too. I'm very briefly. Thirdly, the White House, President Obama announced the executive order on women in conflict in August this year. We could have followed up on this issue because that is about they're initiating the strategy on preventing and responding to violence against women and girls globally. So we need to relate this comfort woman issue to this violence against the women. And fourth, still we have been trying many times at the United Nations. I think still we have a great opportunity to pursue at the United Nations continuously. And the fifth, I provide six, keep promoting public awareness and education. Although people might change, the history would not change itself. So if you keep educating people, we can do it now. I come with a win and win strategies. We could have between Japan and Korea, we can have a regional cooperation, intercultural dialogue, and activities of religious entities, and identity politics in promoting reconciliation within and between Japanese and South Korean societies today that we could explore. And another, finally, keep educating in the United States and about these comfort woman issues. Whenever, I think while I was serving as a president, we had a seminar about more than 40 different universities. We invite the surviving victims and we made seminars, exhibit. I was amazed how many people know about the comfort woman, very rare. So I think keep promoting about educational comfort women, that it will be a great public awareness. And today Professor Stetz already mentioned, so that I give a great, highly commend on also Dr. Taeshil Kim, who made a really big public awareness in her film. And this is oral documentation. I think that plays a significant role. Keep the history as it was, as it is, because surviving comfort woman, we only have now in Korea around less than 60 now. So we need to keep up oral documents, have a public awareness, so that will keep the whole world know about the truth. Well, so finally, so I conclude, our future strategy is to consolidate and expand the principles based on House Resolution 121, the already existing United Nations resolutions, and the White House Executive Order on Women in Violence. Furthermore, the surviving victim in Guam needs to speak the truth for the justice of American victims, and Japan should explain the historical truth to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing up the Guam. So our last presenter is Young-Soon Min, professor of UC Irvine, and then also she's an artist, she's a curator, an activist, and she's going to talk about two very successful the memorial and then project in Korea.
So I wanted to talk about two successes, but mostly about an issue of patriarchy that Chris talked about that underlies so much of Korean culture that still reared its ugly head in relation to the one project in particular. The first project that so I'm going to read excerpts from my paper, but the first project I talk about is the Peace Monument. That's the bronze sculpture project that I documented in the exhibition, and the girl is on the cover of this, the bronze girl with the bird on her shoulder. That sculpture was erected in front of the Japanese embassy, and I think that's a very significant, important aspect of the project, that she is staring at the Japanese embassy, and there's an empty chair for the guest, whoever wants to sit there, to look at the Japanese embassy, and it also has a shadow behind her of harmony that was very evocative and very beautiful. And it was a brilliant piece, and I go into depths about it, but I'll go on to the next project that they talk about, which is the Japanese, the recent establishment for the museum for the comfort women. And since 1994, the Korean Council had envisioned such a museum, and on May 5th, 2012, earlier this year, their quest was finally realized with the grand opening of War and Women's Human Rights Museum in Seoul. In 2000, and so the discussion about this monument, which is a very smart, intelligent museum, goes on. In 2006, the Korean Council had been promised a site at the Soremun Liberation Park in Yeouido by the city of Seoul. This triggered objections from the Korean Liberation Association, the Association for Surviving Family Members of the Martyrs for the Country, and the Association for Patriot Martyrs, who said it was undignified to have a museum for formal comfort women in a setting created to honor martyrs for the country. They protested and stood firmly against the building of the museum in the Liberation Park. The Korean Council was surprised to encounter such resistance from segments of the Koreans themselves about the impurity of the comfort women. The opposition statement included, quote, "It denigrates many independence activists and independence movements, and it is a defamation on patriotic martyrs." Or, quote, "It makes a distorted history that regards Koreans simply as the suffered people from Japan." Or, in quotes, "Granddaughters' problems shouldn't come before grandfathers' problems." Quote, close quotes. In addition to this opposition was another obstacle. The businesses were reluctant to sponsor the construction of the museum, stating that it did not suit the corporate image. Business prejudice about the comfort women elongated the construction process. On the other hand, the Korean government gave 500 million won to financial support for the museum. Though the organizers felt it crucial to build the museum quickly, the city put off the remaining administrative procedures, and the project fell behind. In the meantime, many former comfort women passed away. The Korean Council was finally offered a site that wasn't ideal, but they decided upon this location than to have to wait indefinitely for other sites or for a change of opinions. The new site is located on a hill of a residential neighborhood on, it's a little detail, fairly hidden except for determined viewers. They met the challenges of making the most of the small space, creating a multifaceted museum to recollect, reflect, recover, and record. I go on to describe the museum a bit more in detail, but I'll skip that. The problems that the Korean Council encountered from members of the various organizations associated with the Independence Park, as well as business sectors' reticence to help with the cause, has a long history and its stubborn adherence to patriarchy. A particularly troubling history lies with the 1965 treaty that Park Chung-hee has signed with Japan and has been opposed by the various sectors of the public ever since. This treaty not only absolved Japan from responsibility with the exchange of funds for crimes conducted during the colonial period, but the way that Korea used the funds it received was additionally problematic. Korea's self-incriminating actions came to light when the documents were released January 17, 2005. Not only did the detailed minutes of the 1965 treaty reveal that from the $800 million in grant and soft loans, Korea agreed not to pursue any further compensations from Japan. It was found that it had only distributed a total of $2.5 million to victims, using the remaining $361.5 million for large-scale economic projects, when in fact Korea had specifically demanded $346 million as compensation for estimated 1.03 million Koreans conscripted to labor or military service during the Japanese occupation. When this shameful action of the Korean government was known, it was other victims of Japanese colonialism who bombarded their government with lawsuits and demands for compensation, not the victims of sexual slavery by the Japanese. In acknowledging their faulty history in addressing the comfort women, the Korean government agreed to compensate the victims of colonial rule and divide a minimum of $400 million among those conscripted as soldiers, military civilians, and laborers or comfort women. While the loss of moral superiority of Korean past government's action was rectified by recent government actions, age-old patriarchy continues to haunt comfort women to this day as the cause of their prolonged silence, but also at the roots of the opposition they face among Koreans. With roots in Confucianism dating to the Joseon dynasty, female chastity was reverenced, and the sexual double standard that discriminated against women and tolerated male promiscuity left female victims at fault rather than the male offender. With deeply rooted Confucian values, the suffering of comfort women with their brothel experience were intensified by an internalized ideal of chastity. The comfort women felt that even as a victim of sexual assault, they should find a way, quote, a way to regain their trampled dignity in extreme cases through suicide, close quotes. Given that comfort women returned to Korea to a similarly patriarchal society critical of unchaste women, it became easier to understand why many of the survivors hid their degrading experiences so fearfully and for so long, and why it took it took Kim Hak-soon at her landmark testimony in 1991, 50 years, almost 50 years for her to come out for it. Having achieved the successful realization of the two arts and cultural projects discussed above that will ensure the life and vitality of their cause, the Korean Council must still hold close to their heart and regard as their greatest accomplishments the addressing and liberating women from internalization of Confucian values of chastity in order to fully restore the harmony's honor. And I'm incredibly honored to have Yi Young-soo here, because she is not one of these women who internalized this shame, because she was very brave to come out and speak for her honor. Thank you.
We have three discussants. We have some raised some questions and comments. Maybe Sammy, you the first one. Okay, Doyeon.
Okay, Professor Min, you mentioned there's Confucianism in Korea. My question to you is, Korea is a very modern country, and there's a lot of trends. And me just being a Korean American here in the United States, I have a conflict of culture sometimes between my expectations as a descendant of Korean heritage with me being brought up in America. But my question to you is, as you mentioned, Confucianism. What role do you see in Confucianism versus Westernization for the comfort women issue among the Korean people in Korea, and how is that perceived?
The last part was, what's the...
How the Korean public is perceiving the comfort women issue, while there is the traditions of Confucianism with today's
Right.
Westernization.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the Korea that I encountered last year, recently, was a very modern country, as you say, and but Confucianism is still embedded in Korean culture, and some of it's very good and positive because it's a system, it's a moral system for organization of culture, as much as a very moralistic statutes or system of life. And there's a lot of respect for your elders, which I think is a positive value to have, and respect for elders for their experience and so on. But it's the chastity, the patriarchy that was discussed here. That's just that's at the root of the problem. But not only was it the problem of chaste women that was at the issue, but it was that in and of itself that was an issue for the society, but that it's the women themselves internalized it. They accepted that they had to be chaste, and that it would be that they felt that they were guilty of something, and so it wasn't until the women's movement really mobilized in Korea that said, well, these women have nothing to be guilty of, that they were raped in the camps and the comfort stations, and they were victims of this war crime, and so that it took them a while, 50 years to come to the public, but I think that most women in Korea now, don't have issues with this problem. But I think a lot of the older men, particularly those that were represented by that park, still have issues with the comfort women, just as if that they would denigrate the efforts of the park. So I just think that they're still grappling with the comfort women issue, and it's the business sector also that feel that these issues would smear their campaigns. So I think that Korean society as a whole still has to come a ways, to before they can fully recognize. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your response.
Did you want to talk about this?
I'd like to comment on it, if I may. Okay. I'm a historian by profession. I retired 6 years ago from Georgetown University, and I lived in Korea until I was 20 years old. And I'm an older generation Korean American. So I understand the power of Confucianism, how it's in everybody's fiber. In Korean, if you're a Korean, you scratch the surface, you have Confucian underneath. And I go to Korea every couple of years. What I observe in contemporary Korea is there is a veneer of modern Korea.
Right.
Absolutely super modern and high-rise and everything, and they act so modern and things. But just go 1 inch, less than an inch deep, it's such a conservative Confucianism underneath. And for example, they don't want to deal with issues like Confucianism. It's because the status of former Confucianism before they became sex slaves is a lower class people on the whole. As Chris mentioned, there were some people who got into trouble because of the family debt and things like that. For the most part, they were abducted and drafted from the rural areas away from the attention of average, well-learned and conscious people. So Confucianism includes this hierarchical society. In traditional Confucian society, Korea was very hierarchical, divided society. You could not cross over the classes. For example, if you were born of Yangban and Sangnom, the son could not inherit Yangban's status. So how much more if you are people from the underclass and then experience this shame of sexual slavery. They don't want to talk about it. I'm ashamed to say that. When I first started getting involved, I got calls from my well-meaning high school classmates. I happened to go to very high caliber Gyeonggi and Ihwa, and some of them said, "What are you doing this? You are putting me to shame. What do you need this for? Fame? You do not need fame. You are already a college professor." So, what I said in my paper is just a fraction of what I experienced. As I was writing this, I shed tons of tears. I was so often humiliated and condescended and bad-mouthed and things like that. So I dare say Confucianism is so deep in Korean society, and we need such effort to promote and educate Korean public in general for this issue to move ahead.
Thank you for the great response.
Actually, the discussion is supposed to have 2 questions, but we just reduced to the 1, and because of time constraint. And second discussion would be the Sammy.
Thank you for all your excellent papers. My question is to Dr. Stetz. The notion of teaching and having this truth about the history to be told throughout the U.S. for the younger generation before they hit the maturity is a great idea. But my notion is U.S. never got invaded or controlled under any superpower since its independence. You can emphasizing and you can feel the empathy with the common the trauma, the everyday life trauma, but in this hideous atrocity, is unimaginable. I mean, I am grown, I grew up in Korea, heard about this story, but it's still, for me, it's not easy. But only way that I can relate is by my mother's telling me the war story. How would you describe or initiate for the U.S., not just for young girls, but the one who control that policy of teaching, to initialize or trigger them to have this empathy, and not just third world war that it happened a long time ago across the Pacific. It has to be here and right now. It could be in your mother, it could be in your daughter, and we need to find a way to address it to the U.S. public and the policymaker to do that, and we need the guidance, and I'd like to know what your thoughts are.
Yes, you raise very, very important questions and problems here. And I think some of what I was suggesting was to make the connections across the boundaries of time and across the boundaries of nation and race, and to think in terms of the exploitation and victimization to think in terms of the exploitation and victimization of girls, that this is a subject to use as the point of connection. But that most important, I think, are the first person stories, that it is the immediacy of testimony that reaches students, even those who have very different experiences, and educators who have very different experiences as well, that we feel and we act on feelings when we hear, when we read the stories.
My question is to the founding president, Dong Lee Ham, that you have been the founding president, and the HR 121, the passage of HR 121 was 2007, and since then it's already have passed 5 years. And I think that in a way that we are starting to losing the momentum. So as the founding president of WCCW, what is your recommendation for the organization moving forward to keep the momentum going, and so that we can continue to go with this movement? And just one more thing is that for everyone, I think that also some of you have mentioned that the victims, of surviving victims have been, there's so many victims have already passed away, and there are only few left. And what can we do for the welfare of the surviving victims? I know that it is important to really demand apology, and at the same time, in addition to, I guess, that recover their honor, but also I think that we need to make sure to do something for the welfare of those surviving victims. In addition to demanding reparation for Japanese government to do something about those surviving victims, do you think the Korean government also issues some type of reparation and their inability to not being able to protect those victims? At the same time, there also one of the presenters mentioned about those hidden history about Korean government not being able to use the fund proposed to, it was actually proposed to use for the surviving victims, but the money was used to develop and the different infrastructure project. So do you think that we should also demand Korean government to do something about it to raise awareness?
Thank you for your question. You have a very good point on your question about apology from, not from the Japanese government, but from the Korean government. That's a good point. We have never addressed that issue before. As far as our vision, I don't know whether it's going to be my vision or it's going to be WCCW vision. Anyway, we have covered that area between Dr. So and myself. I have repeatedly made comments about my recommendation earlier at the conference, 20th year annual meetings conference, and again I have repeated if I may represent WCCW, my strong recommendation for the future is to seriously consider establishment of Comfort Women Memorial Museum here in the Washington, D.C., the capital of U.S., also the center of the international community. Also, I really appreciated Dr. So's comments about her approach and strategy. And she named 1, 2, 3, 4 points. And that's good points we could try to approach. The problem is always Japanese government. But now here I hear you saying that why do we have to just finger point at Japanese government alone? We have to include Korean government as well. In Korean, not only 가해자, 피해 국가, 가해 국가, 피해 국가, they are equally responsible for this issue, for the solution of this issue. And that's good approach, and that's going to be our maybe future strategy of our future generation. And so, as far as I'm concerned, I was a young girl when I started this, the issue, 1992. And here now I am very close to 80, and I want to hold in my life to the establishment of the memorial and the museum, if that is achievable in my lifetime. And I want to honor her points of strategy also. Did I answer your question? And let's talk with our president, Christine Choi, about our finger pointing at our own government. Try to see why were you so neglecting? Why were you so irresponsible? We were the weak countries. We had no power. We had nowhere to go. And so poor these men, they had to just obey Japanese government's the military government's power.
We have only 2 questions from you, and even though you have a lot of questions, from Professor Kim Gibson.
I'm not a professor, and I don't have any questions. I have a statement. I think we heard a lot of good things today from the panel, but what to my mind was missing some facts to really learn about the issue, and that is we have to know the history of this issue in the wider context. First of all, you have to understand what happened in 1945. Who was the winner? It was USA. Japan was defeated, and the person who won the war was in charge of dealing with war crimes, and it was USA who did not deal with this crime in 1946 to 1948 at the Tokyo War Crime. Yeah. And the political situation at that point was USA decided to side with Japan so fast because of the Cold War situation that they did not take care of the war crimes in the proper way. So that impact lasted for so long. So the silence of this issue for 50 years, a lot of people say that it's because comfort women themselves were ashamed of themselves. Some of them more, and you would be too if you had to go through that torturous, brutal behavior by another human beings. But so many of them wanted to talk, and they did talk. One of my women says that the only reason that she could survive in that war was because she wanted to come home and tell everyone, and she did. So it was not they who did not want to talk, it was people, their father, their mother, their sisters, their government, everybody, they did not want to hear. So you have to get to know that fact. And of course Japan is responsible for this crime, because it institutionalized sexual slavery. It did it. And of course, as a Korean, I want to say that Koreans' responsibility to take care of their women is very heavy, and they did not do their right job. So I don't want to get the Koreans and the Japanese go free, but I want to make you aware that this issue has to include USA more forcibly in the wider context than you can ever imagine. Until you do that, this is not going to go away. And this is not just an issue of gender. It is an issue of gender, but it is a human issue, and it is an issue of three discrimination: racial, class, and gender. Gender is first, racial. Can you imagine USA letting go 200,000 virgins who went through this sexual slavery if they were all white women? They were all yellow women, and they came from poverty. So I think you have to widen this issue into three issues of race, gender, and class, and get USA come into it and take responsibility.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tae Kim. I fully agree with you, and racial, gender, and class. What did you say? And I wanted to add one more thing: is the universal issues. Actually, I'm very impressed by reading the Professor Simpson's paper about the comfort woman in Japan itself, and then also the other countries. Actually, I want to emphasize that one of our artists, Chang-Jin Lee, interviewed a lot of comfort women, including Dutch comfort women. And so this is a kind of universal issues that we have to go for the next step. So just one more question. Oh, okay.
First, thank you. 25 years ago, I sat in the front parlor of the family home of a good friend of mine, on Taman Chonung Street in Jakarta, Indonesia. And his father, who was a young boy during the Second World War, told a story of a compound that you could still see, it was just across the way, which had a comfort station brothel. Indonesian boy, and the fear that that impunity represented. So there was the violence inside the walls, inside the compound, and there was the violence transmitted across his entire community. A story which I suspect was repeated across occupied Asia, whether it was in Southeast Asia or China, the Philippines, Korea. How do you capture that kind of a story? Because I think that the universalization, the contribution to this message from these broader communities will strengthen the message and lead to a broader coalition, if you would, which will lead to communicating this pain and this suffering more broadly across Asia, more broadly here in the United States, and ultimately, one hopes, more comprehensively within Japan itself. And I'll just leave that for the panel. Thank you.
Identify yourself, Kevin.
My name is Kevin O'Reilly. My sister is very happily the mother of those young grandsons that Dr. O spoke so proudly about.
Very brief answer. The broadening of coalitions and support, of course, it's a very important thing. It's also a very complicated political question. If one attempts to, say, for example, deal with the issue of patriarchy by appealing first of all to the patriarchs in the family, you're going to wait a long time to make any progress. So yes, it is very important to broaden these issues and for people to start to understand them in their own terms, in their own lives. But the way to get to that is, first of all, encouraging the consciousness of people who are most directly involved. We could talk politics for quite some time about this point, but I come down to it. It was not the it was not the Japanese themselves, the Japanese government, the military themselves. It was not the Korean collaborators of that military who knew the most about comfort women abuses. They weren't the ones to come forward first. No, they're being dragged into the light. And I think in time they'll we all come to learn things over generations. But you understand what I'm saying?
I think the museum, I just want to add that the museum that the Korean Council built in Korea that just opened this May achieves what you're talking about because they use it. I think the museum idea here would be a great idea because it gives you an opportunity.
Similar to Holocaust Museum.
Right.
Why not?
They try to present it's about human rights, war and human rights museum, and so it places the comfort women within a larger spectrum of events, and they have a lot of examples of other human rights, current human rights events going on that they are engaged in. So, you get, but they initially start out by identifying the comfort women issue, and you get to experience their problems and their experience. But then, at the very end, you are placing that within a larger contemporary context of a lot of other human rights issues. And I think that in terms of getting Japan's attention, building your own monument or a museum is a perfect way to get their irate attention, actually.
It's rather not trying to debate against Japanese play games, but it's just to try to comment the fact in the history. So we should all concentrate and honor what happened in the past and what should be done in the future. We rather want to focus on that historical grounds, not anymore playing with Japanese government's irresponsible attitude, and we don't want to finger point Japanese government anymore. That's my.
Okay, let's continue this discussion during the dinner time, and then my turn to our closing remarks will be Congressman Michael Honda.
And,
Okay, thank you. I want to
you are
thank the panelists, and I think we should give them a round of applause. There's probably 4 or 5 variety of ways of approaching the issues and thinking about it, from the point of art, the point of educating folks, the point from history, the point from different kinds of activisms, and targeting different institutions or things. But as I was sitting here listening, I sort of recall how I got involved, why I got involved. I got involved because I heard that the Ministry of Education was eliminating this kind of information in their textbooks. And as a teacher, that's wrong. Why? It creates a whole generation and continuous generation of ignorance. Okay, that's number one. So these folks become victims. The other one was the youngsters who grew up prior to 1942, prior to 1937, 35, when Japan was moving and changing their society. The power structure may have not changed, but how they did things and how they transferred this concept of Bushido and militarism and things like that to the young people, so that by the time they became adults and soldiers, they had a distaste for people who give up or had an attitude that was, I guess you could verge it on racism. And if it's true that Japan said that we're going to expand our sphere of influence, not unlike the westward movement of our country, the Manifest Destiny, it was both probably based on race and power. which Dr. Simpson talks about. And I think power is something that we have to continuously keep in our mind, and information, ignorance, and who's the victim. If that's true, then I think a lot of people are still burdening under the idea that Japan was going to Asia to free them from Western powers, which really wasn't a bad idea. Really, because the Western powers went all through Asia and trying to corner the market, if you will. The Boxer Revolution and the Opium Wars was not about China trying to keep opium and control that. It was pushing opium away because opium was being used to subjugate and make the population docile so that people be less resistant to trade, I think. So I could be lying to you, okay? So what you have to do is check it out. But all these things on a global stage are moving on. We got into the war because we needed to get into Europe, so we chose ways to get Japan to make the wrong move, and they did. Roosevelt didn't go to the South Pacific or to Japan first, did he, to fight World War II. He said to MacArthur, hang on, we're going to Europe first, and then we'll come back. Didn't send him anything. And this is not to say it was all wrong, this is hindsight. So MacArthur had to leave the Philippines. We had the Bataan March, and we have our soldiers, the Filipinos, become prisoners of war, be used as slaves in Asia and Japan. Another story. But the fact remains that there's a lot of stuff we're not taught in our schools. So we grow up with a little bit of information, not enough. So with this comfort woman thing, I said as a teacher, this is wrong, not teaching your youngsters. It has to be changed. That was the motivation. Because I know that when I grew up in this country, nobody taught me about my people. Nobody taught me about Native Americans. Nobody taught me about slavery, the economic issues, and let alone the human rights issues. But motivation, I think, has to be really looked at when we look at national kinds of actions. Looking for an apology from Japan, I thought to myself, how can a whole nation of people who are compassionate, who are smart, who understand, human dignity and things like that, behave in such a way that they deny that this had even occurred? And I started to learn. They were never taught. The older ones would reject it. You could blame it on Buddhism or whatever you want, but the older folks just did not want to deal with it. The politics, I think someone talked about the war crimes, Ms. Gibson. She's right. We did not deal with Japan as we did with Germany. I asked her, did we have a peace treaty with Germany? We did. We signed a peace treaty with them.
Well, we were the occupation power up until the 1990s, actually.
Right, okay. And we had a Marshall Plan.
Right.
And stuff like that. But with Japan, we sat down and started to design a peace treaty that took 7 years to write and ratify. Why? What were we negotiating for 7 years? Right, 1952, it was signed in San Francisco. What did we bargain away? I don't know. We have to find out. Yeah, you have the places where we did human experiments. We couldn't do that. The Japanese did to the Chinese. We got that information, I'll bet. I'll bet you that there's some things that went on in terms of letting go some of the war criminals. Because MacArthur released, 13, 15, 17 war criminals and let them go. Who were they? And were they grandparents of current prime ministers? LDP has been in power for almost 70 years. Is there a relationship to that? So, and then, in 1965, they said there was this treaty of normalization between Korea and Japan. And when I asked the question, someone told me in the university, when I was talking to the university in Korea, they said, why is it that our parliament has not passed a resolution on this? I don't know, I didn't know. And when I came back last August, I raised the question to about 3 or 4 parliamentarians and said, is it true? And then in September, they passed one. I don't know whether the conversation had anything to do with it, but there was an acknowledgement now. So it seems to me that one of the key things that we need to think about is, how do you educate the public to move the politicians to do the right thing? Their politicians are different than ours. Their politicians, you put public pressure on them, they're going to do the right thing. And the mark of a good person, they can be Asians, Confucians, Buddhists, Christian, Muslim, is a person of conscience. And a person of conscience, when they understand something, regardless of their upbringing, will say, we have to fix it. And I think that that's the path that we have to start looking at. We can go to the UN, we can raise issues, but we have to continuously educate the people, not only in Japan, but I think if we want Japan to apologize, I think that's a target. But we can get our colleagues and our friends, like the churches and other scholars and other people to start talking and exchanging information, because the soldiers who are dying right now are confessing. And why aren't we taking that information and making that continuous loop in the media until people start to understand, and these soldiers are sincere and regretting what it is that they did as a young person. And so I think that we'll continue to keep visiting these legislators. But like I say, legislators change, but the government is still an organism that's responsible for its past, its present, and its future.
Thank you so much for all the presenters and discussants, and thank you for the audience for your active learning. And then why don't we give them a big round of applause? And thank you. And